Hey friends, Mary Rose here. It's so nice to see you on this Wednesday at 1 p.m. Pacific. I am going to remind those of you who are on Facebook to do that Facebook thing. I think most of you have because I see lots of comments already and I can see everybody's name. But if you are watching from Facebook and you want to leave a comment and participate, just go to streamyard.com/Facebook and give permission to show your name. Housekeeping accomplished. Well, I'm very excited to be here today, and I got excited preparing for today's live stream. So this is live and it is extemporaneous. This is not a written presentation, but I do think about them a lot. And today it's such an interesting subject, this subject of world building as it pertains to writing. And here come my big air quotes, fantasy fiction. And I put that in air quotes because one of the things we're going to try to unravel together today is what exactly do we mean by fantasy? When we're writing fiction, isn't it all made up to an extent, I might argue? So we've got a lot of fun things to wrestle with today. So I have some examples I want to share. So I have some notes I'm going to refer to. And I'm particularly glad that storyteller Hilary is here because it's thanks to Hilary that we've got this topic. She asked a really interesting question, and based on the question from a couple of weeks ago, we're going to expand it today and talk about it for our full time. So let me just say hi to the folks that are here. Erin, hello. Jay, hello. Hilary, hello. Molly, hello. Terry, hello. And even more. So that's wonderful. I always welcome your comments and questions, and I have a feeling that you're going to help me provide examples for the kinds of things that we're going to talk about today. If anybody's new to this live stream, watching live or watching the replay, they're both good. Let me just introduce myself. My name is Mary Rose Wood. I'm an author. I'm best known for writing middle grade fiction, which the topic of world building and fantasy and middle grade, go together like peanut butter and good dark chocolate. So I'm extra interested in this today. The Incorrigible Children of Ashton Place is a middle grade series that I wrote, and my most recent book is called Alice's Farm: A Rabbit's Tale. That's now out in both hardcover and paperback, and so you can check out my books and learn about me on my website. I'll link that below the video. But this YouTube channel is really focused not on my writing, but on yours. I'm also the founder of Path of the Storyteller, which is a program, community space, and really just a wonderful gang of writers. It's like a whole world. Talk about world building. I feel like we've built a world at Path of the Storyteller, where I teach and mentor writers who are really ready to be more intentional about their writing practice and to level up and be a reader ready, which is my definition of ready to publish. Right? It's the readers we want to please at the end of the day, I believe. So there's lots to learn on the journey to being able to do that. And that's what we're here to talk about. So story structure is a topic we return to again and again. Writing craft we return to again and again. And the mindset of the working writer, which is often some of the most interesting and fruitful discussions that we have. Today, we're probably going to dip in a little bit to all three, but probably mostly story structure craft, storytelling today. This notion of world building. All right, so I've already thrown a virtual bouquet of roses to Hilary. Oh, let me say hi to Nancy too. Great to see you here, Nancy. What a wonderful group. Virtual bouquet of roses to storyteller Hilary, who's here. Because a few weeks ago, I was talking about getting started on a new book, which many of us do at the beginning of a year. If we haven't got a book to work on, we're like, yes, time to start a new book. I've recently started a new book. I'm sure many of you have as well. So we were talking about that. And one of the things that I offered as a resource, as a practical thing that you could do to help get your juices flowing for a new book was research. And Hilary asked the very deceptively simple question, which is, okay, research is good, but how do you research if what you're writing is a fantasy novel? Now, It's such an interesting question, and I thank you, Hilary, for posing it, because it's really given me a lot to think about. It raises so many other questions. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I want to talk about the idea of world building, right? Which is what we call it when we've given ourselves the task of building an entire world, a cosmology, a society, you know, a land with its own rules and regulations, as it pertains to fantasy fiction and all of the related genres that kind of get lumped in with fantasy or nibble around the edges of fantasy, by which I mean, you know, sci-fi, dystopian, alternate history, you know, there's all kind of magic realism. Like, there's a lot of terminology I want to unravel today, as well as fiction in general, because even fiction that is purportedly, here they come again, realistic fiction, my air quotes, realistic fiction, world building is still a task that writers must undertake. It doesn't go away just because you're not in Middle Earth, right? So we're going to talk about world building in all of those genres, and we're also going to talk about how it works in fiction in general. And before we're done today, I hope that I have succeeded in messing with your heads a little bit about what all these words mean, how they overlap, right? And I want to keep coming back as we wind our way through to this question of research and what role it can play in our writing, depending on which of these types of stories we've undertaken to tell. And that's the practical part. I like to be practical and give you guys some tools that you can actually put to use in your work. All right. So research will also be a topic that we get to today. So let me just say right now, this talk today, I don't intend it to be of interest only to people writing epic fantasy. I think it's going to have something to offer all of you writers, because we're all in the same business of creating imagined worlds, right? And I'm going to try to offer a bunch of examples, right, to keep broadening the discussion. All right, so ready to hop in? Are we ready to pass through the Phantom Toll booth? Get into the wardrobe? Step on the transporter beam? Are we ready to do that? Enter this imagined world of this live stream? I hope so. Now that we've arrived in our new world, I want to just point out the obvious, which is that all fiction is made up. That's why it's called fiction, right? So that's what divides fiction from nonfiction. When we say something is fiction, we are coming right out and telling everybody, I made this up. This is not real. These characters are not real people. This place is not a real place. Now, we all know that quote unquote realistic fiction often derives closely from the real world as we understand it, sometimes the real experiences of the author. That's kind of a whole cottage industry, right? Trying to track down the real influences on an author's work. Where did they get that from? What made them think of that? Who's that character based on, right? So even within realistic fiction, which is a phrase that strikes me like the famous oxymoron jumbo shrimp, right? Realistic fiction. There's a sort of how much of it is real, how much of it is made up. That's always a very soft membrane, soft permeable membrane. But all fiction is made up, like on the face of it. That's something that we've decided by calling it fiction. We're not writing nonfiction, we're writing fiction. So it is a story that is set in a world that may resemble the real world in many ways, but it is not the real world. It is some kind of carefully crafted, curated vision that is intended to resemble the real world. That's about as real as realistic fiction can get. It's intended to resemble the real world. We're asking our readers to suspend their disbelief, right? In that great phrase, and just say, yeah, this is real. This is something that could happen. But we storytellers all know how much craft, how much curation, right? How many decisions go into crafting a story. So even a realistic story is a kind of a heavily artificial undertaking. So just wanted to lay that out. Now, when we say that this is a fictional story intended to resemble the real world, then we are led to the next question, which is, which real world? What real world? Can we even agree on what a real world is? Now, think about it for a minute, because I don't think anybody can just leap out and say, yes, everyone everywhere completely agrees on all the parameters of reality, because obviously that is not the case. That's not how human beings operate. What do we have when we want to try to find objective truth about things? We have the scientific method. That's about the best thing that we've come up with, and it's a great thing. I'm all about the scientific method, and I blow a chef's kiss to the scientists out there who are doing such amazing work always. But is fiction the scientific method? Is it designed to depict things that can be proven by means of experiments that can be repeated and data that can be analyzed? Well, no, of course, that's got nothing to do with fiction. That's what scientific papers and journals are intended to do, but that's not why people pick up a novel, right? So what are novels about? What is fiction about? Fiction tends to be about far more subjective topics like human behavior, human nature, human motivations, human values. So if you, first of all, think about the stories you love, you can quickly start to see that this is the case, that they are about characters placed in predicaments where their worldview, their values, their notion of what they're capable of, their capacity to make moral decisions, their capacity to step out of their comfort zone and achieve things that they never thought they could. Like, that's what stories are full of. It's human experience. And when you start to talk about human experience, the scientific method is not that helpful because each human has their own subjective experience. So when we start to talk about a world that is intended to seem realistic in the realm of human experience, the question of which world, which human is first and foremost. You can have human beings living in one town and their world operates according to a certain set of values, and that people in that town might have a kind of a typical range of experiences. They might follow a certain pattern of going through life, a journey toward maturation. That's their world. That's reality, right? The people in the next town might be operating according to a completely different set of values. They may have a different moral framework. They may have different rituals, different paths to maturation, different definitions of what it means to be right and wrong, good and evil, mature and immature. So whose reality is the world that we're sitting in? Now, in real life, you can find an example of town A and an example of town B. But in fiction, you can't just say, well, this is realistic, because which town, the reality of which town is it? Likewise, you can go into one of those towns and you can find people who live not only next door to each other, but within the same household, who may have extremely different ways of thinking, different values, different ways of making moral decisions. Motivation, the capacity to make decisions, this is what storytelling is all about. This is how characters exist on the page in a way that's interesting and recognizable to us as readers. So all of the endless variety of that, it's almost like there's a reality for every potential protagonist. And in fact, there is, which is why it's so important for us as writers to do the work in the first act of our storytelling, the beginning, to establish, to delineate the world of this particular story the protagonist, the hero of this particular story, and what their relationship to their world is. Are they at peace with their world? Do they understand their world? Are they an outcast from their world? Are they in grudging obedience to their world? You see, just defining the world and defining the hero is not enough. You've immediately got to put it in some kind of relationship. And we talk a lot in story structure about establishing the hero right away and using the first act to define their world and what's wrong with it. What are the cracks in the foundation of it? Where are the instabilities of it? Where is it about to fall apart? And we talk about needing to do this with real specificity because that's where the entire story is going to rise from. And you can see that just because you've decided to write realistic fiction as opposed to fantasy fiction, your imaginative work and the amount of specificity and world building that you have to do is the same. So that's one of my basic messages for today. So those of you that are writing realistic fiction, take it to heart. You don't have to skip the world building just because you've decided that you're trying to resemble real life, because we don't know which version of real life you're talking about unless you tell us you have to build that world. Now, let's move over a little bit to this notion of fantasy. Whenever we say, well, no, that's not my intention. My intention is not to resemble the real world, whatever that is. I am going to be adding elements to my story. My story contains elements or settings or societal structures that are invented, that I, the writer, am inventing. Now, this is now gets us closer to a more traditional idea of what people mean when they say fantasy fiction. But here's the thing I want you to ponder. There's a slider bar at work here, right? Because even the realistic fiction is invented and the world is built by the writer. And so when we start adding things to the world that are not intended to resemble whatever version of reality we subscribe to, we have control. Let me say, we have complete control about what kind of invented elements we add and how many of them we add, how thickly we lay it on, how foundational we make it. And so there's a slider bar that that you can just push from reality just sort of a little bit and still be writing in a fantasy realm, but there's a mix of realistic things and fantastical things. You can push the slider bar further so that it really feels like a fully changed world, a world that is not really intended to resemble reality in many ways. Or you can push it all the way to the edge, and then you're really in the realm of like epic fantasy where it's languages and maps and how to curse in Klingon, and just a whole invented realm and whole invented world. But that slider bar has infinite gradations on it, and depending on where you are and what kind of story you want to tell, you've got amazing control and finesse, probably more than you think. And the subject that sparked this conversation, the subject of research. How does research come into play? I'm going to argue and show you in a few examples that I'm about to share that research actually never stops being incredibly useful. That research, of course, is helpful when you're trying to create an illusion of reality, but research also plays potentially a really, really useful role, even if your slider bar of fantasy elements is pushed all the way to the side where it is an absolutely invented world. All right. So how about some quick genre talk? I am going to give examples, but before I do, let's just run through some of the terminology. And of course, if you have questions or anything like that, please feel free to leave them in the comments. I'm glancing over and trying to keep an eye on your participation as we go. So let's just talk about what we call, depending on where that slider bar of invention is, what do we call books? And again, these terms are sort of subjective and they evolve and they've changed over time. I'm sure they'll continue to change over time. First of all, there is such a thing as historical fiction, right? And this is quite simply fiction, a made-up story set in the past. Now, is the fact that something is set in the past does not make it history, right? Because it's still fiction. It's still something that this author has made up. But many writers of historical fiction will choose to try to be as accurate as they can be to the historical period in which they've chosen to set their tale. And they may do a lot of research and they may pride themselves on historical accuracy, but it's still fiction. And there's only so much historical accuracy that is available to us. Now, if we're writing something set in the 1970s and we grew up in the 1970s and we kept journals, we may feel that our historical accuracy is great. If we're writing something set in the 1920s and we have done research and we've read all the books and we're really scholarly about it, we may say, oh, my historical accuracy is really good. But the truth is, we can never completely know with accuracy everything about the past. We have very hardworking historians, archaeologists, anthropologists, social scientists, all kinds of people who take a scientific approach, who look at evidence, who examine texts, who look at objects, who excavate ruins. I mean, who really try to recreate the past for us. And I love this. I love historians. I lap this stuff up. I think it's fascinating because it teaches us about what? About human nature. It's our shared subject as writers. So when you're writing historical fiction, you might be trying to be accurate, but it can never be completely accurate. Now, let's say you take that slider bar, which is not all the way, right? There's going to be some inaccuracy. It's just kind of built in. And you on purpose change stuff. Then you've got alternative history. Alternative history is a historical fiction that changes stuff about the past on purpose. It's part of the storytelling. It's an imagined different way that history might have been or might have played out. So we've got historical fiction and alternative histories as well. We have animal stories. Now, are animal stories fantasy? Well, animals are real, right? So what makes an animal story fantasy? Well, what makes it fantasy is that we have to, just as we have to make an extra leap to imagine ourselves in the experience of a historical period from the past, we humans have to make quite a leap to imagine ourselves in the experience of animals. And therefore, the slider bar of accuracy of realism is going to have to be kind of far up, right? Now, does that mean that every animal story is equally fantastical? No, because some people write animal stories and do tons of research to try to recreate the actual experience of animals, how they live, what their life cycle is, what their social structures are, how they communicate, what their habitat is like. I mean, you can bring a tremendous effort toward accuracy when writing about animals, just as you can when writing historical fiction. But if you decide I'm going to write about animals, and my animals are going to be wearing little tweed jackets and they can ride a bicycle, so now you're writing animal fantasy, right? You've moved the slider bar further. You're no longer intending to replicate the experience of real animals. You've taken liberties, and now you're using animals really in an overtly metaphorical way, right? Because you're really representing human behavior. You're just using animal characters to do it. There have been many important books written with this very intention. That's another example. Let's talk about science. Science is in the business of trying to figure out reality, of trying to help us understand it better, right? But one of the most popular fantastical genres is science fiction. Now, you can write articles for scientific journals and have them be as true as our current level of understanding is. But our current level of understanding, scientifically speaking, is also completely a moving target. What we understood 10 years ago is so different than what we understand now. If you are interested in the history of science, you can just see the way people who have really tried to get to the truth of things have done it step by step and spent decades, centuries, millennia believing things that we now find utterly cockamamie and are just so patently not right. But that was the best they knew at the time, right? So we can be really pro science and pro the scientific method and be filled with curiosity to learn ever more about this shared reality. But it doesn't mean that science is like a perfect reality, because it isn't. It's a work in progress. Science fiction, which I love and I know has many, many fans out there, uses the stuff of actual science and starts to pose questions about it. What if this technology involved into that? Is there a way that this might someday be possible, even though we don't know how it might work? Right? So science fiction, good science fiction, tends to take things that are sort of plausible extrapolations from actual science and use them to create a whole world of possibilities that can, result in full societies with technology, with political systems and experiences that we can't imagine ever being so. But just remember that the things that we live every day now and take for granted are things that the scientists of the past could never have imagined being so. Although some of them were really good at imagining things, right? When you look at some of the sort of visionary science fiction writers, the things that they imagine that have come to pass are quite interesting. So we've got science fiction as another kind of fantastical realm, another sort of notch on that slider bar. What about stories that involve monsters? Are those fantasy? Are they fantasy? Well, I would say that monsters like vampires and werewolves and, those are mythic creatures. There's a lot of them are derived from mythology, and they have a kind of an ancient resonance. You can argue, of course, and I think many do, that horror as a genre, which is a very popular genre, both in literature and in film, obviously, is fantasy, because it's inventing these things that are of monstrous size and scale, things that are outside the everyday, right? We have vampire bats, but we don't have actual vampires. So we've taken something and we've moved the slider bar far, and now we have this thing. But here's the truth of it, of course, is that monstrousness, the concept of being monstrous or monstrous events, is real. Things can get all of a sudden larger than life in a devastating and terrifying way. And we can look at natural catastrophes as kind of monstrous events, but we can also look, alas, at human nature, which has no shortage of evidence that it is capable of monstrousness, of monstrous behavior. And so once again, monsters, it's not like if there are monsters of fantasy, if there are no monsters, it's not like, no. Monstrousness is a slider bar. How are we choosing to depict the idea of monstrousness in our work? And just sort of think about all of the gradations of that you can find. Similarly, stories that involve magic. And this could be so many different kinds of magic. There's all kinds of magic. There's folkloric magic. There's sort of traditional wizard type magic, but magic is a thing. Magic is an ancient idea, and it keeps getting incorporated in stories in all kinds of ways, right? From the recent wild popularity of the Harry Potter series, which envisions an entire world where magic is a thing. I believe I mentioned Susanna Clarke's wonderful Jonathan, what is it? Oh no, I'm blanking on the title. Doctor Strange and Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which is a really interesting example of how some of these genres combine. So we'll return to that. So just know that magic is also a thing on the slider bar. And in fact, there's a phrase, a genre called magic realism that has its own history and connections to certain authors from Latin America, and it's really interesting. But the phrase itself is almost an indication of magic realism, of the fact that it is simply a story where that slider bar of magic is pushed up a little bit. It's not pushed up that much. It's a world that's intending to seem realistic, except for these swellings of magic or supernatural things. And again, this is very subjective, because one person's magic is another person's serendipity, is another person's spiritual belief system, right? I mean, these things are not fixed in stone. It's very, very subjective. So it's a slippery slope between a lot of these categories. And because of that, there's a whole other phrase called speculative fiction that is, in a sense, a container that holds them all. And it's a way of talking about all kinds of storytelling in which there are some elements that are outside this commonly held belief about what is real, but that's all very blurry to begin with. All right, I hope you guys are still with me, because that was just a lot of terminology, but I'm trying to give a survey that shows that there's so much nuance, and which is, I think, great. But nuance and complexity and overlap and opportunities to combine all of this stuff. It's not like reality or fantasy or science fiction or horror or magic realism. It is in a really interesting teasing apart of this imaginative process that we bring to our storytelling. And there's another term, in addition to speculative fiction, that you all know and use, and I just wanted to call it out as well, which is dystopian fiction. Now, how does dystopian fiction relate to all of these other kinds of non-realistic genres? Well, to me, a dystopian fiction is like, and it could be a number of combinations of these things, but it's basically a what if the world goes wrong. It's an invented world that's really bad, and it's often, to my take on it, it's often not just an invented world that's really bad. It's an invented world that's gone really bad. It's imagining that some world that was functional has slid off the tracks and is now terrible, is now operating from a very bad framework. It's oppressive, it's tyrannical, it's it's bereft of the possibility of life. It's a really interesting impulse, right? So it's not a utopian vision in which we imagine things getting better until there's this potential perfection at the end of a long road of improvement. It's a dystopian vision in which there was a world that was okay, but it made bad choices, and now it's in a bad place. And the nature of dystopian fiction is that our heroes, our characters, are involved in some capacity with trying to endure this terrible world and perhaps put it back on track. So, dystopian fiction, yet another example. I'm going to share Jay's comment, which I really like. So much freedom to create whatever kind of world we want. Love the slider bar image. Exactly, Jay. So this is very much my point. It's not like we have to pick a genre and stay in our lane. We are really able to use the relationship between the invention of fiction and our imaginative capacity to imagine whatever. And what I hope I've just demonstrated is an incredibly rich buffet of traditions of incorporating non-realistic elements into fictional works for a variety of reasons and with a variety of effects. So on that note, let me throw in some examples, and you're going to be able to think of a million more. So this is obviously not an exhaustive list, but just a few that came to mind to me as having a particularly complex overlapping or relationship, and also having a relationship to the notion of research. Now, as I go through these examples, here's what I want you to think about. Which are the fantasy or speculative elements? Where has the author in each case moved that slider bar so that it is clearly no longer intended to be mirroring the experience that any of us might see out the window, okay? Which of the genres or combination of genres that I've just talked about might be present? And the combination is often going to be the key. How far has that slider bar been pushed? Has it been pushed a little bit or has it been pushed a lot? And to get back to Hilary's original great question, what role did research play in conceiving of the invented world that in each of these works? All right, I'm going to start with The Handmaid's Tale by the Canadian author Margaret Atwood. Now, some of you may have read this book. Some of you may be familiar with the TV series that was made of it. It was first published in 1985, so not 100 years ago, but not that recently. It's a while back. If you really place it in the time that she wrote it, that I think adds a level of admiration for the imaginative leap that Margaret Atwood took. If you're not familiar, The Handmaid's Tale is set in a near future, which somehow said 2005, for a book that was published in 1985, maybe it was around the early part of the 2000s. That was the intended, time of this. And the premise that Margaret Atwood offers is that an authoritarian religious group has violently overthrown the government of the United States. And in its place, they have installed a nightmarishly repressive regime that, among many other forms of oppression, is strictly regulating the lives of women according specifically to their reproductive capacity. It is a brutal read and disturbing stuff. But let's talk about these questions. What genre is it? Is it science fiction because it's set in the future? It's set in a future in which things have gone horribly wrong. I think most of us would agree. So that makes it dystopian fiction, perhaps. It's speculative fiction because it falls under that category. But it's based on a what if that involves the actual United States of America having an actual political coup by a type of organization that does exist in real life. So is it an alternative history set in the future? Is it satire? And I'm going to define the word satire in a minute. But if it is satire, it is certainly the grimmest kind of political and social satire. Now, I want you to think about what it might be. But I want to also share with you that Margaret Atwood has obviously given many interviews about this book and its sequel set in the same world. And she's made a point of saying that everything that happens in these books, all of the brutalities and all of the ways that people try to control other people and the types of events are things that have really happened in human history. And that in her case, this research was very much a part of her way of moving that slider bar. She wanted to move that slider bar as far as she wanted to move it, but she didn't want to move it to the point where someone could say, Margaret, you made that up completely, right? No one would ever do that. That could never happen, because in every case that you might say, oh my gosh, no one would ever do that. That could never happen. You can point to human history and you could say, oh no, people did exactly that. And that's exactly what happened. So research was a huge part of the vision for this world. She just took all of this truth from human history and wove it into a very powerful work of fiction. It's a work of speculative fiction for sure, but it overlaps science fiction, dystopian fiction, alternative history, right? It's got elements of all of these things. She told the story that she wanted to tell, and she used her imaginative capacity and her research to put it all together. That's an example. Now, we need some comedy after talking about The Handmaid's Tale. So let me talk for a minute about a film that I personally really enjoyed. And a lot of people are really enjoying it, obviously, because it's very popular right now. It's a film called Don't Look Up, written and directed by Adam McKay. Now, like The Handmaid's Tale, it is set in the near future. And the what if of this particular story is that two scientists discover that a comet is about to obliterate the Earth. There's 6 months left. They try to get the government to do something about it. They're trying to get science to be able to somehow prevent this from happening. But instead, they run into a series of obstacles. And all of these obstacles have to do with, guess what? Human nature. So there's the self-serving leaders of government, the ratings-obsessed media, the science-denying public, and last but not least, the twisted, narcissistic privilege and entitlement of the billionaires who may actually be running the world behind the scenes. How hilarious, right? I'm going to give everyone a moment to wipe away the tears. It is hilarious and heartbreaking. I found the movie to be hilarious and heartbreaking, but what is it? Is it science fiction? Is it dystopian fiction? Is it speculative? Is it an alternative history? Or is this truly what we can call satire, political satire? So to define the word satire in this context, satire is exaggerating things, using exaggeration or irony to offer some kind of critique of what's real, usually by the use of comedy. So another definition of satire, and I just thought of this morning, so feel free to quote me on it. It's dystopian with jokes. That's satire. So what is Don't Look Up? Is it none of these things? Is it all of these things? Again, I leave it to you. But by adding this business of the comet, that's really the only thing that's an invention, right? And the research is, of course, that we are always looking for things that are going to hit the Earth. Scientists are on this. It's a perfectly plausible thing that could happen. Things have hit the Earth in the past and caused mass extinction events. It's based on science, right? It's not something that could never happen. It has, in fact, happened, right? So just like Margaret Atwood, the writer here, Adam McKay, has taken something that happened once and imagines it happening again and places it in a slightly, the slider bar of exaggeration, let's say, is turned up a bit, enough to be funny, right? It's turned up to the little marker that says satire, but it incorporates so much exploration, right? Of past history, of imagined future history. And of course, he is openly describing the film as an attempt to use this imminent destruction of the comet crash as a stand-in for, guess what? Climate change, which is real, which is science, and which, our planet is having a hard time. And when I say our planet and its inhabitants, our planet is coping the best it can, I'm sure. And the inhabitants of this planet, the human inhabitants, are going through a lot of the types of obstacles that he portrays in the movie. How fantastical is it? I'll leave that up to you to decide. But think of all the research that went into that film. How does the government work? How does social media work? What's possible? What protocols might be in place to engage in case this actually does happen someday? How might people react? It's just a lot of things to ponder. Now let me grab an example that is from the realm that most of us would consider inarguably epic fantasy, full stop. The slider bar is all the way to the right. Everybody knows. Mary Rose, you may say like, oh, I can't define fantasy, but I know it when I see it. surely Game of Thrones is epic fantasy. When I say Game of Thrones, I'm using that as a familiar shorthand for the series of novels by George R.R. Martin, really called A Song of Ice and Fire. Massive, massive world building. This series, the first one was published in 1996, by the way, just to give it a little perspective. If you're not familiar with it at all I can say is it puts the epic in epic. Massive world building. The series is basically so massive that he's not been able to finish it yet. It's immensely long and complicated. A lot of fun to read. I've read a lot of it. I haven't read all of it. But there are 5 kingdoms and there's one throne. It's like a huge game of musical chairs because there's a lot of vying for this one throne that's going to rule them all. But there are 2 main families who are vying for the throne, the single throne. The title of Game of Thrones sort of, uses that notion of musical chairs in a way. I think it's really cool. The 2 families that are vying for the single throne are called the Starks and the Lannisters. Now, massive world building, lots of subplots. We can't go into it all here, but the most important thing to know is that this is a battle for the throne of a kingdom or an empire, and the 2 combatants are a family called the Starks and the family called the Lannisters. Now, what an incredible imagination he has, right? Well, not if you know your British history, because if you know your 15th century English history, you may have heard of the Wars of the Roses. What were the Wars of the Roses? This was a period of civil war fought by 2 rival branches of the royal family, which was the Plantagenets, right? The 2 branches that were vying for the throne were the Yorks and the Lancasters, not the Starks and the Lannisters, the Yorks and the Lancaster. They wanted the throne of England. So what is Game of Thrones? We thought it was epic fantasy. Is it alternative history? What is it? I mean, what is it? Is this an accident? Did he just accidentally come up with those names? Starks and the Lannisters versus the Yorks and the Lancasters? In fact, he did not. George R.R. Martin is explicit about the way he based this epic fantasy on English history. I'm going to actually quote from an interview that he gave. He said, "My model for this was the 4-volume history of the Plantagenets that Thomas B. Costain wrote in the 1950s. It's an old-fashioned history. He's not interested in analyzing socioeconomic trends or cultural shifts so much as the plots and the betrayals, all the juicy stuff." Now, he went into a history, an actual 4-volume history, and he stole all the good parts. He stole models for the characters. He stole the types of political chess game maneuvering, the plotting, the betrayals, as he says, the juicy stuff, the good stuff. And he used this research as a kind of a framework to fill out this vast, epic fantasy world. And at some point, you know what else he threw in, of course? Monsters. Not only are there dragons, but there are zombies. So he's grabbing from all kinds of source material. Did he do research about zombies? Did he do research about the history of dragon depictions? I'm sure that he did. But the main thing that he did was he researched all of the maneuverings and the cast of characters of the actual history of the Wars of the Roses period in England. Cool, right? So I'm going to have one more and then we'll wrap up. I've saved the mothership for last, if you will. Forgive me. I'm a huge fan of The Hobbit by Tolkien. And as has often been written about, and Tolkien himself was explicit about this other kind of emblem of epic fantasy is not something he made up. It's all based on research. He was a scholar of Icelandic mythology. He knew all about these Norse Viking myths, and so much of the plotting and the imagery of these books was drawn from his scholarship. All right. But that's not all it's drawn from, because there are many articles written, obviously tons and tons of scholarship about Tolkien. And if you like this stuff, you can look it up and you'll fall down a hobbit hole to keep you entertained for a long time. But he based so many of the places and images and stuff in this epic work on things that were just very personal. The Shire, where Bilbo lives, and where, sort of the homeland of the hobbits, is based on this part of England that he knew very well. There's even an image in one article that I looked at while I was researching this that showed the clock tower in a town, that's something that he would have seen all the time. And it's like, oh, look, there's the Eye of Sauron. He used what he knew. So he had this incredible scholarly background. He did the research. He had the research at his fingertips. But then he wove in all kinds of references to real life. And certainly his real experiences fighting in World War I, in my opinion, are extremely influential on the plotting and imagery of The Hobbit itself, right? Which is basically about a poor, ill-equipped fellow who is dragged off to war against his, wishes and better judgment, and has to survive. And it falls upon his little, very, very adorably, clearly English shoulders to somehow bring peace to the world, right? That's kind of what The Hobbit is about. And he has to see a lot of his friends get killed, and then tries to go home again, and he can't quite settle back into civilian life, which is a very psychologically accurate and moving thing. So is that fantasy? You be the judge. Yes, it's an invented world. It's got all the goodies. It's got the maps. It's got the runes. It's got the languages. But there's so much that's not made up. There's so much that's drawn from this research and tradition of mythology. And there's so much that's personal as well. So those of you who are kind of interested in this now, maybe you never thought you'd like fantasy, you'd never write it, you don't like to read it, but I hope that I've just kind of mushed it up a little bit in your mind, just maybe reframe the way you think about what it means to invent things, to create elements of fantasy in what is essentially a made-up experience anyway, which is fictional. I do want to point out that some of the most impactful storytelling that humans react to and engage with definitely falls into this realm. And when you think about the iconic impact, the kind of global stature of something like the Harry Potter series, Star Wars, which is, again, it's got a lot of these elements in it. Star Trek, my personal favorite invented sci-fi world. But think about the entire Marvel universe. I mean, it's like these are like modern mythologies, is what's happened with these. This kind of invented landscape with all of this stuff going on. They become our modern mythologies, and so they have an impact that is wildly outsized. It's not just, I read a book, I think you like it. It's like, it's the Marvel universe. It's a mad cast of characters. There's a backstory. There's a lot of people really, really engaged in it. This has always been true, though. This is not just a modern development. Our original stories, the oldest stories that come down to us, are things like Gilgamesh. It's like, there's a warrior, there's a monster, there's a buddy story. It's got all these different genre type elements built in. Look at Homer's Odyssey. The Trojan War was absolutely real, historical thing that happened. Were the sirens real? Right? Were all of the sort of monstrous and magical things that happens to Odysseus as he tries to get home real? No, a lot of them are clearly made up, but it's woven together with the real experience of a soldier who's been at war for 10 years and takes 10 years to get home. Really interesting stuff. Dante's Inferno, another really important work of literature in the sort of Western storytelling tradition. It's a trip to the underworld. Is that science fiction, dystopian fiction? What is that? Think about all of these things. Shakespeare used magic all the time. All his Midsummer Night's Dream has fairies in it. The Tempest has Prospero, who's kind of a great sorcerer, a wizard, use of magic in it, has monsters, Caliban. I mean, all of these elements are everywhere in storytelling. I want to wrap up. There's one that I love to mention as well, Philip Roth's book, The Plot Against America, which is very much an alternative history that asks, what if Charles Lindbergh won the presidential election in 1940? Again, a tremendous amount of research, because this was a person who, Lindbergh was a person who could conceivably have been imagined to have taken the country in a more authoritarian direction. And that's what that novel is about. It's an alternative history. Sort of, in that case, the slider bar is just sort of tweaking one element, but then all of the consequences of that one thing, what if that one thing happened differently than it actually did, become the stuff of his imaginative world. I want to wrap up with a little shout out to a wonderful lesson by the very well-known and well-loved screenwriting guru, Robert McKee, who in his book, Story, and in the workshops that he teaches, points out something wonderful in one of my favorite movies, Casablanca. That's why I want to end with it, because I get to talk about Casablanca for a hot second. The entire plot of Casablanca hinges upon this one element. It is set in World War II. There are Nazis. It's occupying France. Some of the French are collaborating. Some of them are in resistance. This is all from the historical record, right? So call it a historical work of historical fiction, if you like. But the entire plot of this particular film involves folks who want to get out of Casablanca, maybe get out of war-torn Europe, get to the United States, get to someplace that's free, that's not occupied by the Nazis. They need these special letters of transit, which are signed by Charles de Gaulle. And if you have these letters, they can't stop you at the border. It's like a guaranteed get out of Casablanca free card. Now, Robert McKee hilariously describes how never in the history of World War II, Casablanca, or anything else, did anything like these letters of transit exist. The screenwriters made them up. They made them up. Why did they make them up? Because this is what world building is for. It's so that you can put the elements in your storytelling that allow your hero to actually have stakes, have kind of rules to bump up against, to be in a world that's going to provide obstacles, so that as the hero takes the journey toward their mission, that there's a kind of a confined, well-defined rules of the game, a kind of arena of combat. There's stuff that lets you know that you're winning, and there's stuff that lets you know that you're losing. And it's very important, right? Because when we are telling a story, it's a journey of transformation. And so we want our readers to be able to tell whether things are getting better or worse for our hero. It can't just be random events. And so in Casablanca, everyone's trying to get the letters of transit. If you have the letters of transit, it's good. If they know you have the letters of transit, it's bad, because they're going to come kill you to get them. It's a very valuable object. And so all kinds of plotting can be attached to the obtaining, keeping, and ultimate using, right? There's only two of them. Can 3 people leave on that plane? No, it can only be 2. Which of the 2 of our 3 principal characters will it be? So over and over again, the wholesale invention of these letters of transit, the decision that there's only 2 of them, and that they have that kind of inarguable value, the whole plot revolves around this. It's a pure invention. Is it meant to seem realistic? I don't think they cared. It was great. It worked wonderfully. And it gave Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman so much to do, because these letters of transit are the thing. They're the central point of desire of the whole story. So here's what I have to offer you all. And I hope this has been of interest. When you sit down to write your own work, no matter where that slider bar is falling on your own work, remember that your world building, research is always your friend, no matter where you are in trying to be realistic or making stuff up. Sometimes it's the research that you do when you're writing full-blown invented worlds that gives them the verisimilitude that makes them really work. I think that, what George R.R. Martin did in the Game of Thrones and its subsequent books by basing them on this actual warring royal families, or two branches of the same family, actually, is a great example of just how useful research can be, even if you're in full-blown fantasy. But if you're not, you're still creating a world that has to be specific enough that we can follow the rules of the game, that we understand what your hero is up against. What are the limits of what can happen, right? Because we want to be able to put our heroes under pressure. And so in order for there to be pressure, there have to be limits on what can happen. So the age-old caution about writing magic in stories, the magic can't just be in every scene, oh, and then he waved his magic wand and he solved his problem. It ruins the storytelling, and you can all understand that easily. I don't need to explain that anymore. There have to be real stakes in order for storytelling to proceed. And our world building is not like a game of Minecraft where we're just adding rooms. We're not just inventing and adding stuff because it's cool. We're really trying to define the rules of a particular game, and then we're going to raise the stakes as high as we can, and we're going to drop our hero like at the beginning of the game board, and we're going to send them through it. But the stakes are going to be recognizable stakes, right? It's all of these other trappings that give you this, infinite amount of nuance and invention and creativity that you can bring to bear to tell a story that is going to satisfy your reader. All fiction is made up. And guess who's in charge? It's you, my friends. You are the bosses of your books. And I am always interested to know more about what you're working on and what you're writing. So thank you so much for attending this live stream. And I'm just quickly looking at the comments here. Oh, these are some great ones. Nancy is observing the underpinnings of real life give the fantasy energy. I think they give it a lot of structural integrity, Nancy. I think I made that comment before seeing your comment. It's very, very, very true. And I'm going to close with what Jay has to say, which is, yes, the world is invented and imagined, but the emotional world is true. This is exactly my closing point, Jay, and you said it very beautifully. All of this other stuff, the makey up, what we consider these speculative elements, they're just fun. They're cool. They give us like such an incredible palette of stuff that we can work with. But our stories are always going to be based in some kind of emotional truth, some journey of transformation, a hero in a world that they've got to travel through in a way that it remains coherent to the reader. So you can never let the world building make things incoherent to the reader. It may be big and it may be expansive and it may be really fascinating, but fundamentally it's the character. No matter how vast the Lord of the Rings books may get, it's Frodo that we're worried about, right? It's Frodo and his relationships that we're worried about. It's his survival. It's his spiritual condition that we're worried about. Is he going to be ruined by that ring or not, right? So it always comes down to emotional truth. So thank you for that comment, Jay. Very wise as ever. Love this. Thanks to Hilary. I don't know if you're still here, Hilary, but thank you for this great suggestion. Wonderful topic. Love to hear what you guys want to talk about next. Please feel free to leave comments below the video. As you see, it's sometimes very fruitful. I love it when the suggestions come from you. Sometimes those turn out to be the most interesting things. I hope to see you next Wednesday at 1 p.m. Pacific time on this channel. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe. And if you liked this talk, you can give it a thumbs up. YouTube likes it if you do that. I wish you a very good week. Happy writing till we meet again. And I invite you to check out some of the stories that I mentioned here, or to think about some of the stories that you might know that contain speculative elements, and try to figure out for yourself the answers to those questions about genre what role does research play, and just how far did this author decide to push that slider bar in each of these realms? Be well. I'll see you next time.